President Cyril Ramaphosa will deliver the ANC's January 8th statement tomorrow. Yesterday, he spoke about lost public trust in the party. It seems a long way from the 8th of January 1912, when the ANC was formed. For some historical context, now I'm joined via Skype by Dr. Garth Benneyworth, the head of Heritage Studies at Sol Plaatje University. Doctor, thanks a lot for joining us this morning. And I guess the question is, what was on the minds of the people who actually founded the African National Congress, or at the time it was the South African Natives National Congress in 1912?
Good morning to you, and thank you for the opportunity. If we look at the context of the first 10 years in the 20th century, it comes out of the South African War, which ended in 1902, which completely disenfranchised the black population in terms of any sort of post-war peace settlement as such. It comes off the back of massive land displacements, concentration camps, and the emergence of the White Union of 1910, consolidating British rule and also Afrikaner interests at that time. Two with that would be then between 1910 and 1913, in which the South African Congress was formed as such, later the ANC, is that lead-up was building up to the 1913 Land Act, which effectively dispossessed every single black South African within their own country. So you have the emergence of the First World War coming in shortly after the formation of the party as such, or the Congress, and you have the Land Act coming in, which dispossessed the entire population of the representation that party represented. So in that, in a nutshell, there's the issues of land, there's issues of war, there's the issues of displacement, and also the beginning of urbanization, industrialization in South Africa.
I mean, we're building up to looking at where the liberation movement is now, because it is the longest liberation movement on the African continent, 108 years later. But before we go into that, let's talk a little bit about the radicalization of such a movement in the 1940s. I mean, obviously, when we saw the likes of Nelson Mandela come to the fore, the formation of that ANC Youth League.
Correct. Again, in the context of the 1940s, in between two world wars, and you've got massive urbanization going on in South Africa, which we still see. It's a trend now. It is a global trend, but at that time it was the industrialization of the country, the emergence of the urban sort of population as being the dominant factor versus the agricultural, rural sort of proletariat or population as such. And in that, there were the old ways of doing things, where in fact certain leaders in the party and their allies were in fact from a different era, and this is a natural thing that happens in an historical context, where you will have the emergence of a younger movement who actually see ways differently. So hence the emergence of the Youth League under Mandela and his contemporaries at that time.
I mean, one can see that just from the conversation that we're having, that the intention of the African National Congress kept evolving to meet the needs of the time. So before we get to this time, let's go into the banning in 1960 till about 1990. That's 30 years where it had to operate underground, going into exile. Any indication that the reality changed when it comes to the way in which the ANC had its practices, strategy, the tactics from which it operated?
Well, most certainly. I mean, with the Sharpeville Massacre in 1961 and various other regime oppression techniques at that time, we see the change from peaceful protests, the old ways of doing things, into the emergence of the armed struggle. And that, of course, has its connection to areas such as Lilies Leaf in Rivonia, and also the role of Lutuli on the one hand, and the emergence of MK or Mkhonto we Sizwe on the other hand, and a different approach being taken, because a different approach was necessary. I mean, the old techniques were not working against the regime that wasn't listening, so other options had to occur. And we see that going through. I mean, obviously there's the Rivonia raids and Lilies Leaf and the roundups in 1963, 1964, and the trials that followed, and a sort of a kind of like hiatus for a while inside the country, but that then had to go external. Various forces needed to be mobilized, economic, militarily, politically, culturally, and so on. And from that we see a different form of struggle as to the one that was in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. A different context, a different way.
Yeah, I mean, a different context, a different way. And even in the 1960s was proof of that during the Rivonia area and that iconic Rivonia trial speech. And also looking at the formation of the MK, a different era, a different strategy, a different tactic, speaking to the needs of the time.
Correct. responding to what the actual requirements were. I mean, as said earlier, is that the old ways were no longer working, and therefore new methods, new tactics, in line with the strategy at the time, needed to be evolved. I mean, nothing remains static, and perhaps we see that today in the current context in our country now.
I must ask you this then, Doctor. When we're taking a historical context and a historical overview of the African National Congress, obviously with different decades and different forms of its life, giving on different needs for a different approach. And when we're looking at where the ANC is at this moment, would you say that it's evolving effectively to meet the needs of the current dynamic societal construct?
Well, we hear what's being said, and we see what's being done. I think some of the critical factors that one can measure this against is what is actually the impact on the ground. I mean, in a Kimberley context, I mean, where the celebrations or commemorations are now underway, we have Sol Plaatje University, which is in fact one of the new universities post '94, and we see the hope in our students' faces, which is of course a wonderful thing. So on the one hand, we see the hope when they start their studies, and we will commence very shortly with our sixth year. And on the other hand, we see when they graduate, we see the anxieties as to what awaits them out once they've graduated. I mean, what has the economy got for them to offer? Where is their place in society? And I think that is the fundamental question.
And a lot of times, I mean, when you look at a lot of liberation movements on the African continent, one might say they've got a trend of imploding and being the very same oppressors of the people that it was actually intending to liberate. When we're looking at the ANC, does it face a danger of going into that very same trajectory where once you were liberators, but because of certain issues, factionalism, the inability to evolve to meet the needs of the current moment, that you're starting to become oppressive to the very same constituents you were actually deeming to liberate?
Well, exactly. I mean, if one looks at the social dynamic, and I mean, I look at this at my students, for example, and the backgrounds and the life experience that they bring into the room. I mean, where they've actually come from. There is tremendous hope, yes, on the one hand, but on the other hand, we need to think beyond the events of, let's say, 25, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, indeed. We need to deal with the current realities, and that is, for example, a very different world to even 1994, and a very different way of thinking. Ethics and values don't change, or they shouldn't in certain respects. And the adaptation needs to occur. So factionalism in the party, in the organization, on the one hand, we hear all these horrendous allegations of corruption on the other. The ship needs to be fixed, otherwise it may sink.
Let's talk a little bit about the captain of the ship. Who would you, in your opinion, say was that one leader that stands up and being able to unite the African National Congress with its differing ideologies, different stance? I mean, chiefs on one side, intellectuals on one side, academics on the other side, and very vigorous young people with more robust conflict or more like contact-based strategies of liberating people. So who stands out for you?
It's very difficult to single out one individual as such. I mean, one needs to look at each era. And, for example, certain individuals stand out. For example, Chief Albert Luthuli in the context of when he was Secretary General of the ANC and the role that he played in that particular period. Then, again, there's Oliver Tambo, who had to lead this organization in exile, effectively, without the direct contact within the country, but to hold this party together for a very long time, under the challenges that were presented then. Then we have the '94 dispensation that emerged in this country. Then we have Nelson Mandela, on the other hand, who presented a different way of doing things. And then again another era with Thabo Mbeki. And we shall see now, with our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who has presented a new dawn, a new hope, and let's see where that takes us.
We're going to leave it there for this morning, Doctor. Thanks a lot for joining us and shedding some light in terms of that historical